What if I told you that behind New York City's glittering skyline and rich culture lies a history stained with blood and betrayal? Beneath the city's pulse beats a past, ruled by ruthless men whose names struck fear into the hearts of all who dared oppose them. These weren't ordinary criminals, they were architects of chaos, weaving webs of narcotics, violence, and death that spanned far beyond the city streets. Imagine power so absolute that even prison walls couldn't silence their reign, curious to uncover the darkness that still lingers in their wake. Stick around until the end, and you'll find out why even prison walls couldn't contain their sinister legacies. 7. Howard Mason, the mastermind behind the Bios Gang. Howard Mason's name is one that still lingers in the darkest corners of New York. As the head of the Bios Gang in Jamaica, Queens, Mason built a multi-million-dollar drug empire, reaping $200,000 a week from the streets. His power wasn't built on charm, it was built on fear. But what truly cemented Mason's infamy wasn't just his drug operation. In 1988, he made the fateful decision that would seal his reputation in blood. He ordered the assassination of NYPD officer Eddie Byrne. This wasn't just an act of violence, it was a declaration of war against law enforcement. The murder of Officer Byrne sent shockwaves through New York City, and the full force of law enforcement came crashing down on Mason's operation. By 1994, after a series of legal battles, Mason was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But even behind bars, the violence didn't end. His empire continued under the leadership of Eric Bibo Lucas, a ruthless protege who took the Bios Gang to even deadlier extremes. Mason might be locked away in a supermax prison, but the trail of blood he left behind still haunts the streets of Queens, a reminder of how absolute power can corrupt absolutely. 6. Damian World Hardy, the vengeful reign of the Cash Money Brothers. Damian World. Hardy didn't just want control, he wanted vengeance. As the leader of the Cash Money Brothers, CMB, gang, Hardy took over the crack cocaine trade in Brooklyn's Lafayette Gardens housing project in the 1990s. But Hardy's story is one of brutal retaliation. After his brother Myron was gunned down in 1999, Hardy's rage ignited a killing spree that left over 50 people dead. His thirst for revenge transformed Brooklyn's streets into a war zone, making him one of the most feared figures in New York's criminal underworld. But Hardy's influence wasn't limited to the streets. His relationship with rapper Lil' Kim brought him into the public eye. But behind closed doors, their life was a nightmare. Hardy's violent outbursts left Lil' Kim physically scarred, a victim of the same brutality that fueled his criminal empire. Hardy even found himself in a gunfight with 50 Cent's security team, further solidifying his reputation as a man who thrived on chaos. By the time Hardy was arrested in 2005, facing charges for multiple murders and racketeering, his legacy of terror had already taken root. Though imprisoned, the fear he instilled in Brooklyn's streets remains palpable even today. Verse 5. Omar O.G. Mack, Porter, the founder of the United Blood Nation. Omar O.G. Mack. Port didn't just lead a gang, he created one of the most feared gangs in New York's history. His journey began in Rikers Island, where in the early 1990s, he founded the United Blood Nation, UBN. Originally, the gang was formed as a means of protection for African American inmates against rival gangs like the Latin Kings. But once the Bloods took root in the prison system, their influence quickly spread to the streets of New York, sparking a wave of violence that continues to this day. O.G. Mack's brilliance wasn't in his ability to fight, but in his ability to recruit. He divided UBN into different sets, each responsible for different territories and acts of violence, creating a decentralized but powerful network of criminals. Murder, drug trafficking, and robbery became the gang's bread and butter, turning once quiet neighborhoods into battlegrounds. Even after Port was captured and sentenced to life in prison, his creation, the Bloods, continues to wreak havoc in cities across the US. A brutal reminder of the power one man can wield even from behind bars. Jump 4. Luis Felipe. The ruthless control of King Blood. Luis Felipe, also known as King Blood, was the puppet master behind the Latin Kings in New York. Felipe's story is one of power, control, and merciless brutality, all orchestrated from his prison cell. Born in Cuba, Felipe immigrated to the US and quickly became one of the most dangerous men in the Latin Kings. What set Felipe apart wasn't just his ruthlessness, but his ability to maintain control over the gang from behind bars. Even after being sentenced to life in solitary confinement plus 45 years, Felipe continued to order assassinations through letters sent to his followers. Felipe's influence over the Latin Kings was so strong that even after his incarceration, the gang continued to operate under his leadership, carrying out murders and drug deals on his command. His sentencing to solitary confinement was a rare and extreme measure, reflecting just how dangerous authorities believed him to be. Yet, despite his physical isolation, Felipe's control over the gang persisted, making him one of the most feared and notorious gang leaders in New York's criminal history. 3. Alex Rudaj, the Albanian mobster who challenged the mafia. In a city dominated by the Italian mafia for decades, Alex Rudaj, an ambitious Albanian gangster, dared to challenge the status quo. Rudaj began his career as an enforcer for the Gambino crime family, but soon realized he could carve out his own empire. By the early 2000s, Rudaj and his crew were taking over illegal gambling operations in the Bronx and Queens, territories long held by the Italian mafia. But Rudaj wasn't content with just a piece of the pie. He wanted it all. In 2001, he made his boldest move yet, storming a gambling den controlled by the Lucchese crime family and declaring that the Albanians were now in charge. This was more than just a power grab. It was a declaration of war. The Italian mafia didn't take the challenge lightly, and by 2004, Rudaj and his crew were arrested and charged with racketeering, extortion, and more. Though his ambition led to his downfall, Rudaj's audacity in challenging the mafia made him one of the most notorious figures in New York's criminal underworld. 2. Peter, Pistol Pete, Rollock. The relentless leader of sex money murder, Pistol Pete wasn't just another gangster. He was a storm of violence that left the Bronx trembling. As the leader of the sex money murder, SMM crew, Pete earned his nickname by personally carrying out many of the murders his gang ordered. During the late 1980s crack epidemic, Pete's gang dominated the Bronx, creating an atmosphere of fear and bloodshed. But what set SMM apart was their brutal efficiency. Pete didn't delegate the violence, he embraced it. SMM modeled themselves after the Italian mafia, but they were far more reckless. While mafia hits were calculated business moves, SMM's killings were often over petty disputes, escalating quickly into murder. One of the pivotal moments in Pete's reign came in 1997, when he ordered the murder of 2 fellow SMM members during a Thanksgiving football game in front of children and families. This brazen act finally led to Pete's arrest, but even behind bars, his influence persisted. Pete's reign of terror may have ended with a life sentence, but his name still carries weight on the streets of the Bronx. Clarence Preacher Heatley, the Black Hand of Death. At the top of our list is Clarence Preacher Heatley, a man whose very name sent chills through Harlem. Heatley's gang, known as the Preacher Crew, wasn't just a criminal enterprise. It was an empire built on extortion, kidnapping, and murder. At the height of his power in the 1980s, Heatley's crew ruled Harlem with an iron fist, executing anyone who stood in their way. His enforcers, known as janitors, were tasked with cleaning up loose ends, usually in the most violent ways imaginable. One of Heatley's most infamous acts was the 1993 kidnapping of R&B superstar Bobby Brown. Brown was abducted by Heatley's men over a drug debt, and the singer was only released after Whitney Houston delivered the ransom. This high-profile kidnapping was just one of many crimes that led to Heatley's downfall. By 1999, Heatley was indicted for 13 murders, and his reign of terror finally ended. Yet, even from behind bars, the fear he instilled in Harlem lives on, cementing his legacy as the most dangerous gang leader in New York's history.